The air in Aurelia was not merely air. It was a curated atmosphere, a meticulously crafted blend of old money and freshly shaved truffles. It carried the weight of fortunes won and lost, of whispered deals that could shift global markets before the dessert course arrived. Light, soft as spun gold, bled from crystal chandeliers that hung from the vaulted ceiling like frozen constellations, their glow catching on the polished silver and the deep, rich burgundy of the velvet-upholstered chairs. The sound of the room was a symphony of restraint, the gentle, almost apologetic clinking of cutlery against fine porcelain, the hushed murmur of conversations insulated by wealth, the distant, rhythmic pop of a champagne cork being eased from a bottle. This was not a restaurant. It was a sanctuary for the titans of industry, a gilded stage where power was performed with quiet, devastating elegance. Every surface gleamed, every reflection was perfect, and every employee moved with the silent, unobtrusive grace of a ghost, their purpose to be felt but never truly seen. The world outside, with its noise and its struggle, simply ceased to exist at Aurelia's heavy oak doors. Ilara moved through this opulent theater like a phantom, her black and white uniform a stark, simple contrast to the lavish tapestry of her surroundings. Her movements were a study in efficiency, each step precise, each gesture economical. She refilled water glasses with a turn of the wrist so practiced it was nearly imperceptible. She cleared plates with a silence that defied the laws of physics. To the patrons she was a part of the decor, a functional object no more worthy of notice than the damask napkin folded beside their fork. But beneath this veneer of professional invisibility, a universe of fierce intellect and quiet sorrow churned. Her mind, a place that once danced with complex biomedical equations and the elegant structures of cellular biology, was now occupied with the mundane calculus of survival. She felt the weight of every patron's gaze, not as a person being seen, but as an object being assessed for its utility. Her heart, a vessel of grief she kept tightly locked, beat a steady, controlled rhythm, a testament to the iron discipline she had forged in the crucible of loss. Inside her, behind the calm facade of the perfect waitress, lived the ghost of a different life. She would see a flash of a chemical formula in the bubbles of a champagne flute, or hear the echo of a lecture hall in the drone of a banker's monologue. The memory of Johns Hopkins was a phantom limb, an ache for a future that had been amputated. It was the memory of her mother that was the true engine of her existence, a constant, low-burning fire of love and rage. She could still feel the cold, sterile smoothness of the hospital sheets, smell the antiseptic tang that clung to everything, and hear the doctor's voice, thick with practiced sympathy, explaining the diagnosis. A rare, aggressive cancer. And then came the second blow, the one that felt even crueler. The existence of a drug, a miracle of science, priced so far into the stratosphere it might as well have been on another planet. She remembered the nights spent in the university library, her thesis on predatory pharmaceutical pricing models forgotten, as she frantically researched the very company, the very strategy, that was condemning her mother to death. The injustice was a physical thing, a shard of ice lodged permanently in her chest. Into this carefully controlled world strode Marcus and Serafina Vance. They did not simply enter Aurelia, they claimed it. A ripple of deference followed them as the maître d' led them to the best table, the one nestled in a secluded alcove with a panoramic view of the city's glittering skyline. Marcus Vance, CEO of the corporate behemoth Starkwell Industries, looked like a man carved from granite and weariness. His suit was impeccably tailored, but his eyes held a distant, melancholic quality. It was his wife, Serafina, who was the true force of nature. Decades younger, she radiated a brittle, predatory energy. Her couture dress shimmered like oil on water, and the diamonds at her throat caught the light with a cold, hard fire. She moved with the supreme confidence of someone who had never been told no, her gaze sweeping across the room not with interest, but with the dismissive air of a queen surveying her inanimate possessions. She was beautiful, but it was the beauty of a perfectly crafted weapon, all sharp angles and dangerous polish. The tension at their table was a palpable thing, a silent, crackling energy that even Ilara could feel from across the room. While Serafina spoke in sharp, clipped tones about some corporate conquest, Marcus was elsewhere entirely. He had pulled a small, worn leather wallet from his jacket, and from it he had extracted a faded photograph. It was creased at the edges, softened by years of handling. He stared at it with an intensity that rendered the rest of the world, including his stunning wife, completely invisible. Ilara, in a fleeting moment as she passed their table, caught a glimpse of the image, a young woman with a radiant smile, her hair wild and free. A ghost from a past that was clearly not shared with the woman sitting opposite him. Serafina's manicured hand tightened around the stem of her wineglass, her knuckles turning white. A venomous jealousy, cold and absolute, contorted her perfect features into a mask of pure fury. She saw the photograph not as a memory, but as an insurrection. This is a story you won't want to miss. Before we dive into the confrontation that will change everything, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. We love seeing our global audience. And if you enjoy stories where justice is served, make sure you're subscribed so you never miss a moment of righteous revenge. It was then that Serafina's gaze fell upon Ilara. It was a calculated, deliberate act of redirected rage. She saw not a person but a target, a canvas upon which to paint her displeasure. The attack began subtly. A sharp snap of her fingers, a sound that cut through the restaurant's hushed ambiance like a whip crack. She complained that her water was not chilled to the precise temperature she required. Ilara, her face a mask of placid professionalism, replaced it without a word. This only seemed to fuel Serafina's ire. The woman's voice grew louder, laced with a theatrical disdain meant for an audience of one. Her distracted husband. She began to insult Ilara directly, her words dripping with condescension. She critiqued her posture, mocked her uniform, and made a sneering comment about the bleak future of the uneducated service class. With every venomous word, Ilara felt that shard of ice in her chest grow colder, sharper. She kept her breathing even, her hands steady. She would not give this woman the satisfaction of a reaction. The cruelty escalated, reaching its crescendo. Serafina, her face a mask of indignation, saw that her husband was still lost in his reverie, his eyes fixed on the photograph. With a snarl of pure frustration, she decided on an act of unforgivable theater. She picked up her flute of vintage champagne, the bubbles rising in a delicate, golden stream. She looked directly into Ilara's eyes, a malicious smile playing on her lips. Time seemed to slow. Ilara saw the muscles in Serafina's arm tense, the deliberate tilt of the glass. Then, the liquid flew. A cold, shocking spray of expensive alcohol hit her square in the face. It stung her eyes, dripped from her chin, and soaked the collar of her pristine white shirt. The gasp from the surrounding tables was a collective, horrified intake of breath. The restaurant, for the first time all evening, fell into a complete and utter silence. And through the ringing in her ears, Ilara heard Serafina's voice, clear and cutting. "Know your place, girl." The humiliation was a physical blow, a hot wave of shame that threatened to buckle her knees. For a moment, the opulent room dissolved, replaced by the sterile white walls of a hospital room. She saw her mother, frail and tired but smiling, telling her she was proud of her, that her mind would change the world. The memory was a sanctuary and a torment. The scent of champagne was suddenly the scent of antiseptic, and Serafina's sneering face was the face of every corporate ghoul who had put a price tag on her mother's life. A cold fury, pure and solid, solidified in her veins. It was not a hot, reckless anger, but a glacial resolve. She straightened her spine, blinking the champagne from her eyelashes, and met Serafina's hateful stare without flinching. It was in that moment of profound silence, as the entire room held its breath, that the commotion finally broke through Marcus Vance's preoccupation. He looked up from the photograph, his eyes blinking as if waking from a long dream. His gaze passed over his wife's enraged face and landed on Ilara. And he froze. His eyes widened, a storm of disbelief, shock, and a dawning, impossible hope swirling within them. He ignored his wife completely, his focus narrowing entirely on the young woman standing before him, dripping and disgraced, his eyes fixed on a small, unique locket that had been knocked askew around her neck. The world tilted on its axis. For Marcus Vance, the gilded cage of Aurelia, with its hushed tones and suffocating opulence, simply dissolved into an indistinct blur of gold and white. The symphony of clinking silver and muted conversations faded into a dull, distant roar, like the sound of the ocean heard from inside a seashell. All that existed in his universe was the young woman standing before him, her face streaked with tears and champagne, her uniform stained by the casual cruelty of his wife. But it was not her humiliation that held him captive. It was the small object that lay against her collarbone, a glint of silver against the soaked white fabric. A locket. Not just any locket, but one of silver filigree, shaped like a stylized star, with a tiny, almost invisible clasp on its rightmost point. He knew that clasp. He remembered the feel of it under his thumb, the faint click it made when it closed. He had given it to a girl with hair, the color of autumn, and a laugh that could chase away the deepest shadows, a lifetime ago, in a world that no longer seemed to exist. His breath hitched in his throat, a painful, ragged sound. The faded photograph in his wallet felt like it was burning a hole through his jacket. A pale imitation of the impossible reality standing right in front of him. Ilara felt the collective stare of the room as a physical weight, 100 pairs of eyes pressing down on her, witnessing her degradation. The cold liquid was still dripping from her hair onto her shoulders, each drop a fresh reminder of the insult. But the hot flush of shame was being rapidly replaced by something else, something far colder and infinitely more powerful. It was the same feeling she'd had in the hospital, watching the IV drip uselessly into her mother's arm, knowing that a world of wealth and power existed just outside those sterile walls, a world that had deemed her mother's life not worth the cost. Serafina's sneer was the sneer of the pharmaceutical CEO on the news, her casual disdain the disdain of the entire system that had crushed her family. A profound stillness settled over her. Her heartbeat, which had been hammering against her ribs, slowed to a steady, deliberate rhythm. Her hands, which had been trembling, became perfectly still. She was no longer a waitress being humiliated. She was a daughter whose grief had just been given a face, a name, and a target. She lifted her chin, her eyes locking with Serafina's, and for the first time, she let the full, unshielded force of her inner world show in her gaze. It was not anger, it was judgment. The silence in Aurelia was now absolute, a vacuum that seemed to pull all the air from the room. It was a silence so profound that the fizzing of bubbles in a distant glass sounded like a roar. Patrons sat frozen, their forks hovering over their plates, their conversations dead on their lips. This was a breach of the unspoken contract of their world, a moment of raw, ugly emotion in a place designed to insulate them from such things. Into this void, Marcus Vance's voice emerged, not loud, but carrying an intensity that seemed to shake the very foundations of the room. It was thick, with a hope so fragile it was painful to witness. He was not speaking to his wife. He was not speaking to the gawking audience. He was speaking only to Ilara, his eyes wide, pleading, searching her face for an answer to a question he had been asking the darkness for 20 years. He gestured with a trembling hand toward the locket, his voice cracking as he spoke the words that would shatter everything. Is this true? Are you really the lost daughter my private investigator has been searching for? The question hung in the air, electric and impossible. A grenade with the pin pulled. Serafina's perfectly constructed world fractured, the color drained from her face, replaced by a mottled, ugly flush of panic. Her husband's words were an absurdity, a nightmare. she saw the threads of her carefully woven life beginning to unravel. This girl, this insignificant speck, was supposed to be a piece of leverage, a ghost to be exorcised, not a reality to be confronted in the middle of Aurelia. A raw, primal fear, the fear of losing everything, the money, the status, the name, surged through her, manifesting as a sound that was less a word and more a shriek of pure, unadulterated rage. It was a sound that did not belong in this temple of quiet power, a sound that was sharp and jagged and stripped of all pretense. "She's a nobody," she screeched, her voice pitching higher with every syllable, pointing a trembling diamond-clad finger at Alara. "She's a pathetic little waitress trying to swindle you. Marcus, are you insane? Look at her." Her words were a desperate attempt to repaint reality, to force the scene back into a familiar frame of class and power, where she was the queen, and Alara was the dirt beneath her shoes. She turned her venomous gaze on the restaurant manager, who was approaching the table with the cautious, terrified air of a man walking into a lion's cage. He was pale, his professional smile frozen in a rictus of horror. Serafina saw him not as a person but as an instrument of her will, her last, best tool to regain control of the spiraling situation. "Fire her immediately," she commanded, her voice a whip crack of authority. "Get this grifter out of my sight. Do it now, or I will make a scene you'll never recover from. I will personally see to it that Starkwell Industries and every single one of our associates never sets foot in this establishment again." The threat was not idle. It was a nuclear option, a promise to scorch the earth, and the manager understood it perfectly. The blood drained from his face. He looked from Serafina's contorted mask of fury to Marcus's stunned, hopeful face, and then finally to Alara, who stood with an almost unnerving calm amidst the wreckage. He was trapped, a pawn in a game whose rules he did not understand, and he chose the path of least resistance, the path that would quell the immediate storm. He turned to Alara, his eyes filled with a mixture of pity and terror. He couldn't even meet her gaze directly, instead focusing on a point somewhere over her shoulder. "Miss," he began, his voice barely a whisper, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. I am so sorry. We have to ask you to leave. Please, collect your things." The words were a formality. He was firing her. In front of everyone, while she was still soaked in champagne, still reeling from the public humiliation, and the impossible question that had just been asked of her. A security guard, a large man who normally stood like a statue by the door, began to move toward her, his expression grim. This was the final indignity. To be discarded like trash, escorted out as if she were the one who had committed an offense. The injustice of it was a physical blow, but the cold resolve inside her did not waver. It only hardened, crystallizing into something unbreakable. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. She would not fight this. Not here. Not now. The battle had not even begun. As Alara turned to walk away, a quiet dignity in her every step, Marcus finally broke from his stupor. A fire ignited in his eyes, a decisiveness that had been absent for years. He stood up so abruptly that his chair scraped loudly against the marble floor, a jarring sound in the tense silence. "No," he said, his voice low but resonant with newfound authority. He looked at his wife, truly looked at her, and for the first time he did not see the beautiful, dynamic woman he had married. He saw a cruel, panicked stranger, her face twisted by a rage that was both ugly and revealing. "You will not do this, Serafina," he stated, the words not a request, but a command. He then turned to the manager. "She is not fired. She is with me." He didn't wait for a response. He strode past his sputtering wife, past the stunned onlookers, and followed Alara, who had just reached the restaurant's grand oak doors. He pushed them open, stepping out into the cool, damp air of the New York City night, leaving behind a scene of chaos and a wife whose face was a thunderous mask of disbelief and impending doom. The city air was a shock to her system, cold and sharp against her flushed skin. The distant wail of a siren and the rumble of traffic were a stark contrast to the insulated silence of Aurelia. She stood on the pavement, the glittering lights of the city blurring through the unshed tears in her eyes, feeling utterly adrift. She had lost her job, her dignity stripped away in the most public manner imaginable. She was alone, soaked, and the impossible words of the man echoed in her mind, a confusing, painful melody. Then, she heard his voice again, closer this time, just behind her. "Please," Marcus Vance said, his voice softer now, stripped of its boardroom command and filled with a raw, desperate vulnerability. "Please, don't go. Let me explain. Let me just talk to you." She turned slowly, her guard fully up. He was part of that world, the world of untouchable wealth and power. Why should she trust him? What could he possibly have to say that mattered? But then she saw his face in the glow of the streetlights, and the expression in his eyes stopped her cold. It was a profound, soul-deep loneliness, a mirror of the ache she carried within herself. He looked haggard, older than he had in the restaurant's soft lighting. The weight of years of regret seemed to be etched into the lines around his eyes. "My name is Marcus Vance," he said, as if the name itself was a confession, "and I believe I am your father." The words were spoken so quietly they were almost stolen by the wind, yet they landed with the force of a physical impact. Lara felt a wave of dizziness. This couldn't be real. It was a delusion, a cruel joke. Her mother had never spoken of her father, only that he was gone, a closed chapter from a lifelong past. The idea was too fantastic, too much like a fairy tale, and her life had been stripped of fairy tales long ago. She wrapped her arms around herself, a defensive posture against the cold and against the sheer absurdity of the moment. She wanted to run, to disappear back into the anonymity of the city, to go back to her small apartment and the quiet, manageable pain she knew so well. This new, explosive possibility was too much to bear, a hope too dangerous to entertain. He must have seen the disbelief and fear in her eyes. "The locket," he pressed, taking a half-step closer but keeping a respectful distance. "I gave that to your mother, Annalise, the summer before I left for college. We were going to run away together, but my family, they intervened. They were powerful, ruthless. They told me she had left, that she didn't want anything to do with me. They sent me away, and I was a coward. I believed them. I've been searching for her, for you, for years. I hired investigators. They kept hitting dead ends. Until a few weeks ago, when they sent me a grainy photo of a waitress working at Aurelia. A waitress who wore a locket I hadn't seen in over 25 years. His story tumbled out, a torrent of long-suppressed grief and regret. It was messy and filled with pain, but it rang with the unmistakable sound of truth. A black town car, sleek and silent, pulled up to the curb beside them. The driver got out and opened the rear door. "Please," Marcus said again, his voice thick with emotion. "Come with me. Let me show you. I have proof. I have everything." Ilara's mind was a whirlwind. Every instinct screamed at her to refuse, to protect the fragile peace she had built for herself. But the mention of her mother's name, Annalise, spoken with such reverence by this stranger, was a key, turning a lock deep inside her. And there was a cold, pragmatic part of her brain, the scientist's brain, that was now whirring to life. If this was true, it changed everything. It was a data point so significant it would re-render her entire world. Against her better judgment, fueled by a flicker of desperate curiosity and the undeniable sincerity in his eyes, she gave a single, hesitant nod. She slid into the back of the car, the plush leather seats feeling like an alien planet beneath her. The silence during the drive was thick with unspoken questions and decades of lost time. She stared out the window at the city lights streaking by, feeling like a ghost being transported to another dimension, leaving her old life behind on that rain-slicked pavement. They arrived at a penthouse apartment overlooking Central Park, a palace of glass and steel that seemed to float among the stars. The opulence was staggering. far beyond even that of Aurelia. It was cold, impersonal, and it made Ilara's skin crawl. This was the kind of wealth that could have saved her mother 100 times over. Marcus led her into a study lined with dark wood and thousands of books. He didn't offer her a drink or a change of clothes. He seemed to understand that such comforts were irrelevant. He went to a heavy, ornate desk and unlocked a drawer. From it, he pulled a thick, leather-bound folio. He opened it on the desk, and inside were dozens of photographs of a young woman with her mother's smile, letters written in her mother's elegant script, and legal documents detailing the efforts of a private investigation firm that spanned more than a decade. It was a shrine to a ghost, a testament to a search that had consumed a man's life. It was undeniable. It was all true. As the weight of this new reality settled upon her, another part of Marcus's story began to click into place in her analytical mind. He had introduced himself properly now, Marcus Vance, the CEO of Starkwell Industries. The name was famous, a titan in the world of technology and, more recently, biomedical innovation. Her mind, the mind that had devoured industry journals and corporate reports for her thesis, immediately began to cross-reference data. Starkwell Industries, a giant in its field. And who was their biggest, most aggressive competitor in the pharmaceutical space? The name surfaced in her memory with the force of a physical blow, bringing with it a tidal wave of nausea and white-hot rage. Ethelred Pharma. The company that had developed, patented, and then priced the cancer drug just out of her mother's reach. The company whose predatory pricing model she had written thousands of words about, whose callous disregard for human life had become the focal point of her academic and personal fury. The pieces were slotting together in a horrifying mosaic. And then came the final devastating connection, Serafina, his wife. The woman who had just assaulted and humiliated her. Ilara remembered a Forbes article she had read years ago, a profile on the rising stars of the pharmaceutical world. It had featured a young, ambitious executive from Ethelred Pharma, lauded for her ruthless efficiency and her, quote, innovative market capture strategies. The executive's name had been Serafina Croft before her marriage to the Starkwell CEO. The world stopped. The air left her lungs. It wasn't a coincidence. The attack in the restaurant wasn't a random act of cruelty from a bored, wealthy woman. It was calculated. Serafina must have known who she was. She had recognized the threat, the daughter of a woman her company had condemned, now working in a place frequented by her husband. The champagne in her face wasn't just an insult, it was a warning. It was an attempt to silence her, to put her back in her place before she could ever get close to the truth. A fury unlike anything she had ever known erupted inside Ilara. It was no longer a cold, quiet resolve. It was a blazing inferno. Her grief, her intelligence, and her rage fused into a single, sharp point. She looked up from the folio, her eyes meeting Marcus's, and he saw not a lost daughter, but a warrior who had just been handed a sword. The inferno of rage that had ignited within Ilara did not burn hot and wild, but instead condensed into a cold, dense star of pure, unadulterated purpose. The grief for her mother, once a diffuse, aching fog that colored every moment of her life, now had a focal point, a tangible target upon which to direct its immense energy. She looked at the man before her, this stranger who was her father, and saw not a source of comfort or a long-lost family, but a resource. He was a key, a weapon, a gateway into the world that had crushed her own. The opulent study, with its scent of aged leather and wealth, no longer felt intimidating. It felt like an armory. She pushed the folio of her mother's letters aside, the soft touch of the past, a luxury she could no longer afford. Her mind, the brilliant, analytical machine that had been forced into dormancy, roared back to life, processing variables, calculating odds, and formulating a strategy with a speed that was breathtaking. The world had presented her with an equation of profound injustice, and she would now solve it, not with tears, but with the cold, hard logic of retribution. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was devoid of the daughter he had hoped to find. It was the voice of a scientist identifying her objective. Marcus Vance, a man accustomed to commanding boardrooms and dictating the flow of billions of dollars, found himself completely adrift in the face of this young woman's chilling transformation. He had prepared himself for tears, for accusations, for a messy, emotional reunion that would span weeks of difficult conversations. He had not prepared for this. He had not prepared for the calm, assessing gaze of a predator. He saw the fire in her eyes, but it was not the warm glow of rediscovered family. It was the cold, blue flame of a cutting torch. When he offered her anything, a home, an inheritance, a lifetime of apologies, she waved it all away with a dismissive gesture that was eerily reminiscent of Serafina's own arrogance, yet stripped of its petty cruelty and replaced with a terrifying focus. She wanted only one thing from him, a thing he had in abundance but had never considered a weapon in this way. She wanted access. Unfettered, unconditional access to the full weight of Starkwell Industries. She wanted his lawyers, his data analysts, his security consultants, and the bottomless pit of his financial resources. She was not asking to be his daughter, she was asking to be his general, and he, consumed by a tidal wave of guilt and a strange, burgeoning sense of awe, could only nod in stunned agreement. Her first move was not to attack, but to seek counsel. The battlefield was too complex, the enemy too entrenched. She knew her own expertise was a powerful weapon, but she needed a strategist, someone who understood the deep, corrupt currents of the world she was about to enter. The name that surfaced from her memory was Dr. Alistair Finch, her former bioethics professor at Johns Hopkins. He was a brilliant, cantankerous man who had been a guiding light during her studies, a man who saw the pharmaceutical industry not as a business of healing, but as a sprawling criminal enterprise. He had been pushed into a forced early retirement after publishing a scathing paper that drew a direct, irrefutable line between pharmaceutical lobbying and patient mortality rates. He had been professionally silenced. Using Marcus's network, Alara located him within hours. He was living in a small, book-choked apartment in Baltimore, a lion in winter, surrounded by the ghosts of battles he had lost. The meeting was tense, the air thick with the smell of old paper and stale coffee. Finch was a shadow of the fiery intellectual she remembered, his eyes clouded with a weary cynicism. He listened to her story without interruption, his gnarled fingers steepled under his chin. He heard the tale of her mother, of Aethelred Pharma, of Serafina Vance, and the cold fury that now animated the brilliant student he had once mentored. His initial reaction was to warn her away, to tell her that the beast she intended to fight was unkillable, that it would swallow her whole and leave nothing behind but a cautionary tale. He had seen too many good people broken on the wheel of corporate power. He tried to explain the intricate web of influence Serafina would command, the lawyers, the public relations firms, the politicians on her payroll. He painted a grim picture of a war she could not possibly win, but as he spoke, he saw something in her unblinking stare that gave him pause. It was not the naive idealism of a student, it was the cold, hard certainty of a survivor who had already lost everything that mattered. He saw in her the reflection of his own younger self, before the compromises and the defeats had chipped away at his resolve. A long-dormant ember of his own righteous anger began to glow. He finally fell silent, looked at the detailed preliminary file she had already prepared, and a slow, grim smile spread across his face. He would not be her professor. He would be her chief of staff. With Finch as her strategic advisor, Alara's hunt began in earnest. Marcus converted a secure wing of the Starkwell Tower into her private command center, a sterile, glass-walled space that she quickly filled with whiteboards, network diagrams, and the relentless hum of high-powered servers. She explained her theory to Finch and a deeply unsettled Marcus. Serafina was arrogant, a narcissist who believed her own myth. She would have been meticulous in covering her tracks, but her very arrogance was a vulnerability. She would believe that her past, sealed by money and time, was untouchable. Elara wasn't looking for an unlocked door. She was looking for the digital ghost of the key. She spent days, then weeks, immersed in a world of code and data, her fingers flying across keyboards, her eyes scanning endless spreadsheets and archaic data formats. She barely ate, sleeping in short, fitful bursts on a couch in the corner, her dreams filled with algorithms and the faint, fading image of her mother's smile. She was a digital archaeologist, digging through the sediment of forgotten corporate networks, searching for the fossil record of a crime. The work was grueling, a search for a single corrupt file among petabytes of mundane data. They chased down old server manifests from Ethelred Pharma, cross-referencing them with employee access logs from nearly a decade prior. Finch, using his old academic contacts, helped her build a psychological profile of Serafina as a young executive, mapping her ambition, her ruthlessness, and her likely digital habits. They operated on the assumption that she would have used a shadow communication channel, something off the official record, to orchestrate the most damnable parts of the pricing scheme. They hit dead end after dead end, encrypted files they couldn't crack, servers that had been physically destroyed, access logs that had been deliberately and expertly wiped. For a moment, it seemed Serafina's precautions had been perfect. The frustration in the command center was a palpable thing, a heavy blanket of despair that threatened to smother their fragile momentum. Marcus watched from the sidelines, a helpless king pouring resources into a war he didn't understand, his guilt deepening with every failed attempt. It was Finch who pointed them toward their first potential breakthrough. He remembered a name from the periphery of the scandal that had ended his own career. Julian Croft, a man who had been the chief financial officer at Ethelred during Serafina's rise. Croft had been a numbers man, a bean counter known for his meticulous, almost obsessive, record-keeping. He had been abruptly and unceremoniously forced out of the company just months after the controversial cancer drug hit the market, replaced by an executive known for his loyalty to Serafina. He had been given a golden parachute worth over $20 million, a sum clearly intended to purchase his eternal silence. Marcus's private investigators found him living a quiet, secluded life in a heavily wooded estate in rural Vermont. He was a man living in a self-imposed prison of wealth, a ghost haunted by a secret he had been paid to keep. Initial attempts by Marcus's legal team to contact him were met with a wall of terrified silence. His lawyers responded with curt, threatening letters. Elara knew that lawyers and threats would not break a man like Julian Croft. Only a shared humanity could. Against the advice of Marcus's security detail, she flew to Vermont herself. She arranged to meet him not at his sterile mansion, but in a small, worn-out diner off a forgotten highway, a place of cracked vinyl booths and the smell of burnt coffee. When he arrived, he was a wraith, a man shrunken by fear, his eyes constantly darting toward the windows. He was ready to refuse, to walk out before she even spoke a word. But Elara did not begin with accusations or legal threats. She simply told him about her mother. She spoke of the late-night hospital visits, the hollowed-out look in her mother's eyes as her hope faded, the quiet dignity with which she faced a death that could have been prevented. She painted a picture not of a statistic in a financial projection, but of a human being, a life extinguished by a decision made in a boardroom thousands of miles away. She made the abstract horror of his complicity into a concrete, undeniable reality sitting right across the booth from him. She then slid a single piece of paper across the table. It was not a legal document, but a printout of a single obscure budget allocation she had managed to unearth from Ethelred's archived accounts. It was a multi-million-dollar slush fund, labeled only as Market Contingency Planning, authorized by his signature. She explained, in calm, precise detail, how she knew this fund was used for off-the-books lobbying and illegal kickbacks to silence dissenting scientists. She wasn't guessing. She was stating a fact she had already pieced together. She told him that her investigation was not going away, that it was backed by the full power of Starkwell Industries, and that when the truth inevitably came out, His golden parachute would become a lead weight, dragging him down into a federal investigation for conspiracy and fraud. She was offering him a choice: to be a witness or to be a co-conspirator. The fear of prison finally outweighed the fear of Serafina. His carefully constructed wall of silence crumbled. With trembling hands, Julian Croft began to talk, sketching out the architecture of Serafina's crimes on a paper napkin. Julian's confession was a floodgate opening. He gave them everything: the names of the other executives involved, the methods they used to falsify clinical trial cost data, and, most importantly, the location of the specific off-site servers where the most incriminating communications were stored. He described a proprietary, encrypted messaging system Serafina had commissioned, believing it to be untraceable. He gave them the project name, Project Lazarus. It was a sickeningly cynical name for a plan that ensured so many would never rise again. Armed with this new information, Ilara and her team launched a targeted assault on the digital fortress Serafina had built. They felt a surge of triumphant energy, the feeling of the final piece of the puzzle clicking into place. But when they finally gained access to the designated server cluster, located in a nondescript data center in Delaware, they found nothing. The drives were empty, wiped clean with a level of forensic precision that bespoke a recent, professional job. A cold dread settled over the command center. The timing was too perfect. Serafina must have been alerted. Perhaps Julian's sudden trip had been flagged. Perhaps she had moles within Starkwell Industries. Or perhaps she was simply paranoid, conducting regular security sweeps of her past. Whatever the cause, she was actively working against them, a ghost in the machine erasing her own footprints just as they were about to find them. The despair was heavier this time. It felt like a definitive checkmate. Marcus, seeing the exhaustion and defeat on Ilara's face, urged her to stop, to take the information they already had to the authorities. But Ilara knew it wasn't enough. Julian's testimony was powerful, but without the hard data to back it up. It was the word of a disgruntled employee against a corporate titan. Serafina's legal team would shred him on the stand. They needed the documents. They needed Serafina's own words. The hunt had gone cold. The trail vanished into the digital ether. The weight of her mother's memory pressed down on her, a silent accusation that she was failing, that justice would once again be denied. She retreated from the command center, walking through the empty, silent floors of Starkwell Tower in the dead of night. The glittering expanse of New York City spread out below her, a universe of lights that seemed to mock her failure. She stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows, her reflection a pale ghost against the city skyline. She was about to give up, to concede defeat, when a memory from her past sparked in the darkness of her mind. It was a detail from her unfinished thesis, a chapter on corporate mergers and acquisitions. She remembered an obscure but critical part of the process: due diligence. When two companies were considering a merger, the target company had to create a data room, a complete, verified snapshot of its entire operation. Financials, communications, legal liabilities, everything. It was a moment of perfect, legally mandated transparency. She raced back to the command center, her heart hammering with a renewed, frantic hope. She began frantically searching Athelred's corporate history, looking for any proposed mergers during the specific time frame of Serafina's scheme. And there it was. A small, almost forgotten footnote in their corporate history. For a brief 3-month period 9 years ago, Athelred Pharma had been in advanced merger negotiations with a German biotech giant, Bioheim AG. The deal had collapsed at the last minute over valuation disputes, but not before the due diligence process would have been completed. Athelred would have been legally required to provide Bioheim with a complete, mirrored copy of their entire digital infrastructure, including the, quote, Lazarus servers. Under German corporate law, Bioheim would be required to archive that due diligence data for a minimum of 10 years. The data Serafina had just wiped from the servers in Delaware was almost certainly sitting, untouched and forgotten, in a dusty archive in Frankfurt, Germany. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble based on a half-remembered academic detail, but it was the only move they had left. The hunt was back on, and this time, they were not chasing a ghost. They were chasing a time capsule. The next 48 hours were a blur of international logistics and high-stakes legal maneuvering. Marcus, revitalized by Ilara's breakthrough, put the full force of his global connections to work. Starkwell's top legal counsel in Europe was dispatched to Frankfurt. Bioheim, now a subsidiary of a much larger chemical conglomerate, was initially uncooperative, their executives wary of being dragged into a messy corporate feud. But Marcus played his trump card. He had his team dig up the original merger proposal and found evidence that Aethelred had deliberately misrepresented its financial projections. A clear act of bad faith negotiation. He presented Bioheim's current leadership with a choice: grant them access to the archive data room as part of an internal fraud investigation, or face a multi-billion-dollar lawsuit from Starkwell Industries for historical corporate espionage. The German executives, faced with the prospect of a costly and embarrassing public legal battle, quickly capitulated. They granted Illara and a small, hand-picked forensic team access to their off-site archival facility. The facility was a sterile, subterranean bunker on the outskirts of Frankfurt, a concrete tomb where corporate secrets were laid to rest. The air was cold and smelled of ozone from the humming server racks. Led by a grim-faced German archivist, Illara was taken to a sealed section of the vault containing the Bioheim acquisition data from a decade ago. It was all there, stored on rows of magnetic tape drives, an obsolete technology that had inadvertently preserved the data in its original, untampered state. As the forensic team began the slow process of data extraction, Illara felt a profound sense of temporal vertigo. She was reaching back in time, about to read the words that had sealed her mother's fate, words written by a woman who had no idea that the consequences of her actions would one day be brought to light by a daughter she hadn't even known existed. The first files began to appear on her screen. They were the unredacted Project Lazarus communications, and they were more damning than she could have ever imagined. She read emails from Serafina, her language cold and stripped of all humanity, in which she referred to terminally ill patients as decaying assets and discussed, quote, end-of-life revenue capture. She found the financial models, the ones Julian had described, which included a column explicitly titled Projected Mortality Rate versus Price Point, calculating with chilling precision how many thousands of people would die at each pricing tier. The models recommended the highest possible price, arguing that the public relations fallout would be manageable, and the profit margins would be, quote, paradigm shifting. The most damning piece of evidence was a memo, written by Serafina herself, in response to a plea from Aethelred's own chief medical officer, who had raised grave ethical objections to the pricing strategy. Serafina had dismissed his concerns, writing, quote, our fiduciary duty is to our shareholders, not to the statistically insignificant. We are selling a product, not a miracle. It was the smoking gun. It was the voice of the monster, captured and preserved. It was the validation of all her pain, all her anger, all her grief. Back in the Starkwell Tower Command Center, the atmosphere had transformed. The frantic energy of the hunt was replaced by the quiet, lethal intensity of an army preparing for its final assault. The evidence was absolute, irrefutable, and catastrophic. Illara, flanked by Finch and a visibly shaken Marcus, laid out her plan on a large monitor. A press leak was not enough. A lawsuit would take years, allowing Serafina to bury the truth in legal motions and appeals. The justice, she argued, had to be as public and as humiliating as the crime was private and cruel. It had to be a public execution of a reputation, delivered on a stage of Serafina's own making. Her finger tapped on an image on the screen, a promotional flyer for the upcoming annual Starkwell Industries Foundation Charity Gala. It was the premier event of the New York philanthropic season, a night where the titans of industry gathered to publicly celebrate their own generosity. And this year, the keynote speaker, set to receive an award for her, quote, outstanding contributions to corporate ethics and social responsibility, was Serafina Vance. The irony was so profound, so grotesque, that it was the perfect weapon. This gala was Serafina's coronation, the pinnacle of her public image as a benevolent corporate leader and philanthropist. It was the one place where her guard would be completely down, where she would be surrounded by her peers, basking in the glow of their adoration. Ilara's plan was audacious in its simplicity. She would not storm the stage or cause a scene. She would use the very tools of the corporate world against its queen. She would hijack the presentation, replacing Serafina's self-congratulatory slideshow with the cold, hard evidence of her crimes. She would use Serafina's own platform, her own moment of triumph, to deliver the verdict. Marcus, looking at the plan, felt a chill run down his spine. It was brutal, elegant, and perfectly symmetrical. It was a form of justice so complete it was almost poetic. He looked at the young woman before him, the daughter he had just found, and saw not a victim seeking revenge, but an architect of consequences, ready to burn down an empire to honor the memory of one forgotten woman. The final days leading up to the gala were a blur of meticulous preparation. Ilara transformed from an investigator into a theatrical director, choreographing every element of the coming confrontation. She worked tirelessly with Starkwell's elite cybersecurity team, a group of young, brilliant hackers who were more than happy to turn their skills against a corporate predator. They mapped the gala's entire technical infrastructure, finding back doors into the audio-visual systems and creating a foolproof method to seize control of every screen and speaker in the grand ballroom at a moment's notice. Ilara herself curated the presentation. It was not a dry recitation of facts and figures, it was a story. It began with a picture of her mother, young and vibrant, and told the tale of her life, her illness, and her death. It then seamlessly interwove this human tragedy with Serafina's own words, her callous emails and damning memos appearing on screen beside photos of the woman whose life they had extinguished. It was a masterpiece of narrative warfare, designed to strip away Serafina's corporate mask and expose the soulless void beneath. On the evening of the gala, a strange, profound calm settled over Ilara. She stood before a mirror in the suite Marcus had provided for her, a space larger than any apartment she had ever lived in. She was not wearing the black and white uniform of a waitress, a costume of invisibility and subservience. She wore a simple, elegant gown of dark navy blue, a color that spoke of solemnity and purpose. Her hair was pulled back, her face was clear of all but the most minimal makeup. She did not look like a vengeful fury or a corporate warrior. She looked like a woman who had come to tell the truth. She placed the silver star locket, her mother's locket, around her neck. It felt cool against her skin, a familiar anchor in a world that had been turned upside down. She looked at her reflection, and for the first time in a long time, she did not see a grieving daughter or a humiliated worker. She saw herself. She saw Ilara, a woman who had found her purpose in the ashes of her past, ready to walk into the lion's den not with a sword, but with a story. The stage was set, the audience was arriving, and the final act was about to begin. The grand ballroom of the New York Plaza was a universe unto itself, a swirling galaxy of old money and new ambition. The air hummed with a low, contented thrum, a mixture of self-congratulatory whispers, the delicate chime of champagne flutes toasting fortunes, and the distant, lush strains of a string quartet, light from a dozen chandeliers, each one a cascading waterfall of hand-cut crystal, bathed the room in a warm, forgiving glow, glinting off diamond necklaces and the polished brass of the Starkwell Foundation's insignia. On a raised dais at the front of the room, Serafina Vance stood at a podium, bathed in the singular brilliance of a spotlight. She was the star at the center of this opulent solar system, her silver-sequined gown shimmering like a constellation, her smile a carefully calibrated instrument of charm and power. She was in her element, a queen upon her throne, accepting an award for corporate philanthropy, her voice smooth and resonant as she spoke of ethics, responsibility, and the sacred duty of the powerful to uplift the weak. It was the zenith of her public life, a moment of absolute triumph she had meticulously crafted for herself over years of ruthless maneuvering. She felt the adoring gaze of hundreds of the world's most influential people, a wave of validation that was more intoxicating than any vintage champagne. The first sign of the coming cataclysm was a flicker, a subtle, almost imperceptible stutter in the massive LED screen behind her, which was displaying the Starkwell Foundation's elegant, swirling logo. Serafina, ever the consummate professional, paused for a beat, a flicker of annoyance crossing her perfect features, assuming a minor technical glitch. The room's low hum of conversation faltered as a few heads turned. Then the screen went black for a single, heart-stopping second. A collective, nervous murmur rippled through the audience. When the screen reignited, it was not with the corporate logo. Instead, it displayed a single, sun-drenched photograph of a young woman with a radiant, uninhibited smile and wild, wind-blown hair. A woman no one in that room had ever seen before, yet whose image radiated a warmth that was a stark, shocking contrast to the cold perfection of the woman standing before it. It was a photograph of Annalise. Serafina froze, her well-rehearsed words about social impact dying in her throat. Her mind, a finely tuned machine of calculation and control, short-circuited. She stared at the image, a ghost from a past she had worked so hard to bury, and a cold, visceral dread, the likes of which she had not felt in years, began to snake its way up her spine, tightening its icy grip around her heart. Then, from the side of the stage, a figure emerged, moving not with the frantic energy of a stagehand rushing to fix a technical problem, but with the slow, deliberate, and unstoppable grace of fate itself. It was Ilara. She wore a simple, unadorned navy gown, a column of midnight blue against the stage's blinding white light. Her face was calm, her expression unreadable, her steps measured and certain as she walked toward a secondary microphone on the lectern. A wave of confusion and shock washed over the ballroom. People craned their necks, whispering frantically, trying to place this unknown woman who had just hijacked the most prestigious charity event of the year. Serafina turned, her face a mask of disbelief rapidly contorting into a snarl of pure, unadulterated fury. Security guards tensed, starting to move toward the stage, but Marcus Vance, sitting in the front row, raised a single steady hand, his expression one of grim, sorrowful resolve. He stopped them cold. Ilara reached the microphone, her eyes not on the stunned audience or the seething woman beside her, but fixed on the image of her mother projected high above them all, a silent, smiling witness to the justice that was about to unfold. Ilara's voice, when it came, was not loud, but it filled the cavernous, silent ballroom with an unnerving clarity. It was calm, precise, and carried the weight of a truth that could no longer be denied. She began simply by introducing the woman on the screen. She spoke of her mother, Annalise, not as a victim, but as a person, a lover of bad poetry, a brilliant gardener, a woman who had faced death with a quiet courage that was the antithesis of everything Serafina Vance represented. Then, as she spoke, the screen behind her changed. A new document appeared beside her mother's smiling face, an internal, Ethelred pharma email, its subject line cold and clinical. And on that screen for all to see were Serafina's own words projected 20 feet high. The terminally ill demographic represents a decaying asset. Our strategy must focus on end-of-life revenue capture. A collective horrified gasp sucked the air from the room. The screen changed again. A spreadsheet, the one that calculated mortality rates against price points. Then another email, dismissing a doctor's ethical concerns. And finally the memo, the one that sealed her mother's fate and the fates of thousands like her. Our fiduciary duty is to our shareholders, not to the statistically insignificant. Ilara did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She simply read the words aloud, her calm, steady narration, a devastating counterpoint to the monstrous calculus of greed displayed for all to see. The foundation of Serafina's world did not just crack, it disintegrated into dust. The carefully constructed persona of the benevolent philanthropist, the ethical leader, the devoted wife, was publicly and irrevocably executed in a blaze of her own damning words. The whispers in the audience had turned into a roar of outrage. Phones were held aloft, their tiny red lights recording every second of her spectacular fall from grace. She opened her mouth to speak, to deny, to scream, but no sound came out. Her face, which had been a mask of rage, crumbled into the slack, terrified visage of a cornered animal. The spotlight that had been her validation now felt like an interrogation lamp, hot and merciless, exposing every lie, every sin. She stumbled backward, away from the microphone, away from Ilara, her eyes darting around the room, searching for an ally, a friendly face, but finding only a sea of judgment and disgust. A guttural, inhuman sound finally tore from her throat, a shriek of pure, primal despair. She turned and fled, tripping on the hem of her ridiculously expensive gown, her flight from the stage, not a dignified retreat, but the panicked scramble of a guilty soul, pursued by the ghosts of her past and the blinding flashes of 100 cameras capturing the exact moment her empire turned to ash. Type justice in the comments if you got chills when Ilara finally exposed the truth. The aftermath was a tidal wave of consequence that swept through the highest echelons of the corporate and social worlds. News of the gala exploded across the internet, the videos of Serafina's exposure going viral within minutes. Federal investigators, armed with the mountain of evidence Ilara had provided, descended upon Aethelred Pharma and the Vance estate. Serafina's assets were frozen, her board seats were rescinded, and she was left a pariah, facing a future of depositions, trials, and the very real possibility of a prison cell. Marcus divorced her quietly and immediately, the legal proceedings a mere formality to sever a connection that had already been annihilated. In a public statement that rocked the financial world, he announced that Starkwell Industries was severing all ties with its philanthropic foundation and establishing a new, far larger entity in its place, the Annalise Foundation. Its mission was simple and revolutionary: to fund the development of life-saving drugs and then provide them to patients based on need, not on their ability to pay. It was an act of profound corporate atonement, a final, loving tribute from a father to the woman he had lost and the daughter he had found. Ilara did not fade back into the shadows. She stepped into the light, not as an heiress, but as a leader. Marcus offered her a position as the co-chair of the Annalise Foundation and the head of Starkwell's new bioethics division, a role created specifically for her. She accepted. Her days were no longer spent refilling water glasses and enduring the condescension of the wealthy. They were spent in boardrooms, arguing for ethical research practices. They were spent in laboratories, speaking with the kind of brilliant, idealistic scientists she had once been. She used her power, her intellect, and her profound understanding of suffering to ensure that the system that had failed her mother would never fail another family in the same way again. Her transformation was complete. She was no longer defined by her grief, but by her purpose. On a quiet autumn afternoon, she visited her mother's grave, a simple stone marker under a large oak tree. She placed a small bouquet of wildflowers on the grass and ran her fingers over the engraved name. The shard of ice that had been lodged in her chest for so long was finally gone, melted away not by vengeance, but by the warm, steady glow of justice served and a life reclaimed. If Ilara's incredible journey from underdog to powerhouse inspired you, show your support by hitting that like button and sharing this story with someone who needs to see it. And for more unforgettable stories of justice and empowerment, don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell.